The cuffs clicked shut before I could reach Julia. My daughter's scream slicing through the Saturday air. Neighbors frozen in disbelief on their porches. I barely registered Marcus Reed's smug smile as he tightened the plastic restraints around my wife's wrists, his badge glinting in the sun like a threat. "You're in violation," he announced, voice sharp enough to turn heads down the whole block. "That's trespassing. HOA bylaws are clear." My son's hand found mine, tiny, shaking, but defiant. For a split second, everything stilled. The street, the flags, the last of the morning breeze. But under the chaos, something steadier thrummed in my chest. Marcus had no idea what he'd just started. If he'd bothered to read the brass plaque beneath our planter, or looked up at the faded state flag fluttering by the mailbox, he'd have known he wasn't shaming a rule breaker. He was laying hands on the woman who'd written the law he was so eager to weaponize. If you've ever felt your stomach drop watching someone misuse power in plain sight, if you've ever wished you could hit pause, reach through the screen, and stop it, stick with me. Because in the next few minutes, you're going to see what happens when a board president picks a fight with the wrong family, in the wrong neighborhood, at the worst possible time. My name is Michael Sanders. I spent years drafting policy for this state, but before that, I was a son standing where you are now, watching my own father fight for every inch of our legacy. He built this house with calloused hands and a stubborn pride the HOA never managed to break. That planter, the one they claim violates community aesthetic, my dad filled it every spring, right up until the cancer took him. I promised him I'd keep it blooming, no matter what. To us, it isn't just a pot of dirt. It's everything he left behind. But that history, my family's pain, our promise, it means nothing to people like Marcus. They see rules and power, not memories or meaning. The state flag out front, that's more than cloth. Julia carried it the day she was sworn in. She swore her oath to protect families like ours, right here on this porch. And today, the board decided that was worth less than their control. So, when Marcus called security, when he put his hands on Julia in front of our kids, he wasn't just enforcing a rule. He was declaring war on every promise we ever made, every bit of hope still alive in this neighborhood. I knew, as his radio crackled and a small crowd gathered, that this was bigger than a planter or a flag. This was about dignity, about who gets to define what matters on this street. I locked eyes with Julia, searching for fear, but finding only fire. "This isn't over," I mouthed, low enough for only her to hear. She nodded, lips set, chin high. Our kids, pressed against me, took it all in. Their mother, their home, the neighbor's silence. I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders. If you believe every family deserves to stand tall against injustice, join us. Subscribe now and be part of the fight for real change in every neighborhood. That's what Marcus never understood. His bylaws might scare some folks, but they don't stand up to real legacy. Today he thought he could humiliate a family. Instead, he set something bigger in motion, something even the HOA can't stop. He picked the wrong porch, the wrong flag, the wrong story to bulldoze. And in this house, we don't back down. By the time Julia was marched to the end of the walkway, phones were out everywhere. I caught flashes of screens from behind parted curtains, neighbors filming, whispering, or just pretending not to see. The whole block had been yanked awake, but not by compassion, more by curiosity and dread. It was the kind of spectacle people remember long after the paint has peeled from the curbs, the kind they retell at backyard cookouts, except no one wanted to be the first to speak up. For a moment, as Julia was led away, I caught Mrs. Jensen's eyes from behind her lace curtains, eyes that once beamed at our kids from across the street, now wide and wet with something like guilt. I remembered how, not so long ago, she used to invite us over for lemonade on hot evenings, her kitchen always smelling like cinnamon and warm bread. Today she didn't wave, didn't even nod. That small, silent absence felt bigger than any crowd. It hit me that fear had slowly pushed kindness out of every corner of this street, leaving us all alone together. I felt the eyes on my back as I followed, my kids clutching my sides like shields. Marcus didn't look back. He was already moving on, barking orders to the private security he'd brought in just for this. 2 men in crisp uniforms, more eager than qualified. One of them glanced at me, uneasy. The other looked right through me, as if I was the invisible one. All the while, the the neighbors gathered at the edge of their lawns, feet stuck in place, half wishing for something to change, half terrified it would. I couldn't stand the silence. As soon as Julia disappeared into the HOA's temporary security office in the park's recreation center, I went looking for answers. Every step felt heavier than the last. This wasn't just about us anymore. The way the crowd had gathered, the way no one intervened. It was bigger than a single family. This was about what Crestwood Pines had become under Marcus Reed's watch, a place where fear wore the mask of order. Near the basketball courts, I found Paul Jefferson, a neighbor whose kid played on my son's soccer team. Paul was always quick with a joke at the mailbox, but now he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Sorry, Mike," he muttered, voice low. "Marcus has the board running scared. Last month they cited the Thompsons for the color of their shutters. Week before, it was the Smiths for a playset. Everyone's afraid to be next." He shrugged, like that made it okay. The list kept growing as I circled the park. The Perez family, fined for wind chimes. Mrs. Gordon warned about her garden gnome. Each story chipped away at my faith in what this neighborhood was supposed to stand for. It wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. And control, enforced this way, breeds only resentment and silence. I noticed Erin Blanchard, the HOA secretary, lingering at the edge of the playground, watching everything with a face pinched by worry. She had her notepad in hand but wasn't writing. Instead, she kept looking from the office door to the small crowd, as if waiting for someone to step out of line. Our eyes met for a moment. She offered a nod, quick and nervous, then turned away. I recognized something familiar in her posture, someone quietly trapped, uncertain which side to choose. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a standoff in slow motion. No one left the park, but no one dared to raise their voice. Parents whispered, kids played softer, and the HOA's so-called security watched us all with empty expressions. At one point, Marcus strode through the grass, greeting families with a forced smile, reminding everyone the rules were for everyone's benefit. No one challenged him, but no one returned the gesture either. That's how fear grows, quietly, in the cracks between conversations. Back at the house, my son asked if Julia was coming home for dinner. I told him soon, hoping it was true. As night crept in and porch lights flickered on up and down the street, I started to realize just how much the balance had shifted. People weren't just afraid of Marcus, they were afraid of what would happen if they acted. The old sense of neighborly unity had faded, replaced by caution and calculation. Standing on my porch, I looked out at the empty street, the memorial planter casting a long shadow across the flagstones. I thought of my father again, how he'd believed that neighbors stood together, not apart. Crestwood Pines had lost that somewhere along the way, traded it for silence and self-preservation. But fear only works if everyone agrees to play along. And as I watched Erin pause under a streetlight, her eyes darting back toward the recreation center, I wondered if I was the only one already planning to push back. This wasn't just about my family anymore. Marcus had built his power on isolation and silence, but even the deepest shadows crack under enough light. They could try to intimidate us one by one, but sooner or later, someone would have to step forward. Tonight, I decided it would be me. Erin Blanchard stood outside the HOA office long after the crowd thinned, her posture tense as if she couldn't quite let herself leave. I watched her from across the lot, trying to read her body language, arms wrapped tight around her notepad, shoulders drawn up, jaw clenched. Every few seconds, she'd glance back at the rec center door, chewing her lip, then look away when someone walked past. If guilt could be painted on a person, Erin was wearing it like a second skin. The playground behind her had emptied, just a single swing left, creaking in the breeze. I remembered Erin as the neighbor who once organized Halloween for the block, crafting paper bats and ghost stories for every child. Now she stood there, hands trembling, caught between duty and conscience, the old warmth in her face replaced by a shadow of regret. It made me wonder how many others in Crestwood Pines wished for the courage to break their own silence. I hesitated before approaching. The last thing I wanted was to spook her into retreat, but I needed answers, and I'd seen enough today to know Erin wasn't as comfortable with Marcus's tactics as she let on. I kept my steps slow, careful, giving her space to bolt if she wanted. She didn't. Instead, she stared at her feet, shifting her weight from side to side, not daring to look up as I drew closer. "Rough day," I said, voice low enough not to carry. Her fingers flexed on the notepad. She nodded once, just barely, then shook her head as if she couldn't find the right answer. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, thick with everything unspoken. The distant sound of kids playing echoed across the emptying park, a reminder of how far Crestwood Pines had drifted from what it once was. Erin finally lifted her gaze, her eyes red around the edges. She glanced at the notepad, then at me, then away again. Her lips parted, but whatever words she had caught somewhere between fear and regret. I watched her shoulders rise and fall with a shaky breath. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," she managed, just above a whisper. The rec center lights flickered on behind her, casting long shadows across the lot. Erin hugged her notepad tighter, thumb tracing the edge as if it might anchor her. She opened her mouth twice more, each time stopping herself, biting down hard to keep from saying too much. I saw her eyes dart toward the windows, then toward the street where Marcus's car was still parked, like she was weighing every risk, every consequence. She stepped back as a group of board members exited the building, her posture immediately closing off, chin tucking in, arms crossed defensively. Even as they passed, she never quite looked at them, keeping her head down, nodding politely. But the tension in her frame told the real story. She wasn't part of their circle tonight, not really. When the last of them left, she lingered. I waited, giving her time. Finally she spoke, voice cracking. If you need to talk, just wait until after the next meeting, not here." Her eyes flicked to the notepad, to my face, to the ground. I nodded, grateful for even that small crack in the wall. Erin's struggle was plain as day, written in the way she fidgeted with her hair and kept glancing over her shoulder. She wanted to help, but fear had her in a chokehold. Fear of Marcus, of the board, of losing whatever security she thought she had. But something told me she was closer to breaking ranks than she realized. As I left, I caught one last glimpse of her standing under the rec center lights, still hugging that notepad, still wrestling with herself. It struck me how often revolutions start with just one person too honest to keep pretending. Erin wasn't ready yet, but I could see it. The doubt growing, the courage stirring beneath the worry. Back home, the house felt emptier than usual. Julia was finally released, but the sting lingered in her eyes. The kids tiptoed around us, looking for normalcy in the aftermath of public humiliation. I replayed Erin's anxious gestures, the way she'd stood apart from the others, torn between her duty and her conscience. It gave me hope, a fragile one maybe, but enough. In every story like this, there's someone on the fence, someone whose struggle marks the turning point. Tonight, it was Erin, standing there with her notepad and nerves, fighting a battle only she could see. And that was the first crack in Marcus's armor, whether he realized it or not. The next morning, Crestwood Pines felt different. The air was tense, brittle, as if every blade of grass had caught word of what happened the day before. I barely slept, replaying every moment of Julia's arrest, the look on my kids' faces, Erin's hesitance, the way Marcus strutted like he owned the world. It would have been easier to hide, to let the storm blow over and hope we could blend back into the background. But that wasn't who my father raised, and it certainly wasn't what Julia would do. Before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, an email landed in my inbox. An official violation notice, $500 in fines for multiple acts of non-compliance, including unauthorized gatherings and inappropriate display of non-standard landscaping. I scrolled through, jaw tightening with every line. The wording was more aggressive than usual, and the threats were clear. Pay within 10 days, or face daily penalties, legal proceedings, and potential liens. Marcus's name was stamped at the bottom, neat and proud. Holding the letter, I felt a sting of nostalgia for when our first HOA notice was just a friendly reminder about the trash cans. Now, every envelope felt like a loaded threat, every line sharpened by Marcus's new authority. I thought of the day he took over, how he'd promised transparency and unity, shaking hands with everyone at the spring festival. I never would have guessed how quickly all that goodwill could curdle into control. A knock rattled the front door. I found a courier waiting with a second envelope, this one hand-delivered. Marcus wasn't leaving anything to chance. Inside was a copy of the same notice, along with a formal complaint about Julia's conduct. He'd marked it as an emergency action, citing disruption of public order. I felt a cold rage stir in my chest. Emergency action for a woman defending her own home in front of her children? My phone buzzed with texts from neighbors, Paul, Mrs. Gordon, even the Smiths, each sharing new fines, warnings, or reminders about compliance. The board had moved fast, unleashing a fresh wave of paperwork and intimidation overnight. I read them all, noting the common thread. Marcus was tightening his grip, using the chaos as cover for a crackdown. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about obedience. Determined to get answers, I decided to go straight to the source. The HOA's monthly office hours were held at the clubhouse, a sunlit room lined with cheap chairs and motivational posters about community spirit. When I arrived, Marcus was already there, flanked by his two favorite board members. He greeted me with that same practiced smile, barely glancing up from his laptop. "Michael," he said, "I hope you're here to resolve things amicably." The board takes repeated violations very seriously. I kept my voice even, refusing to let his smugness get under my skin. "What exactly is the emergency here, Marcus? A planter? A flag? Or was it the fact that you handcuffed my wife in front of our kids?" He leaned back, folding his arms, unbothered. "You know the rules. Exceptions can't be made, even for public figures." The way he said it, public figures, made my blood boil. So he did know about Julia, or at least suspected. But it didn't change his tactics. If anything, it emboldened him. Marcus was betting that the rest of the neighborhood would stay quiet, that no one would dare risk his wrath by standing up for us. As I pressed him for clarification, he slid a folder across the table. "Everything's in writing. Any further defiance will be treated as a hostile act against the community." His eyes never left mine, daring me to challenge him in his own territory. I left the clubhouse with my fists clenched and my mind racing. The fines, the threats, the orchestrated pressure on our neighbors. It was a calculated campaign, one designed to break resistance before it could take root. But Marcus had made a mistake. He believed fear was a stronger force than memory. He underestimated how far a family would go to protect what matters most. Walking home through the park, I felt the weight of every story I'd gathered over the last 24 hours. The neighborhood wasn't just scared, it was suffocating under rules that had lost all meaning. My kids deserved better. Julia deserved better. Crestwood Pines deserved better. And Marcus Reed, for all his authority, couldn't hide forever behind a stack of bylaws and empty threats. I reached our porch as the sun broke through the clouds, catching on the brass plaque beneath the planter. My father's name glinted back at me, a quiet reminder of what I was fighting for. I promised then, out loud, to the morning air and anyone listening, that I wouldn't let intimidation win. Not this time. The HOA had escalated, but so would I. That afternoon, after Julia settled the kids with a movie and a bowl of popcorn, anything to reclaim a shred of normalcy, I drove across town to the public library. It was quiet, sunlight slanting in across old oak tables, the low hum of computers and distant whispers barely filling the space. I needed answers that Marcus couldn't control, and for that, I needed records, real ones, not the papers he'd stacked so high at the HOA office. I started with the basics, Crestwood Pines' original covenants and restrictions, the board's incorporation paperwork, all the amendments filed over the years. There was a digital archive terminal near the genealogy section. My fingers hovered over the search keys, adrenaline mixing with dread. I half expected to find everything in perfect order. Marcus had always presented himself as a stickler for rules, but the more I dug, the more holes I found. Some amendments were properly stamped and signed, sure, but as I scanned through the scanned PDFs and faded microfiche, one glaring gap emerged. The so-called emergency powers Marcus kept referencing had no formal record. The bylaw about physical detainment and escalating fines, the county had no record of any such amendment being filed, let alone approved by the required two-thirds majority of homeowners. According to the legal framework, those powers simply didn't exist. I sat back, heart pounding, realization dawning. This wasn't just overreach, it was a bluff, dressed up as law. Marcus and the board had been banking on nobody checking, assuming everyone would accept their word as gospel. But by state statute, unfiled amendments and rules never became enforceable. That meant every fine, every threat, every single action tied to that phantom bylaw could be contested, and not just by me, but by every neighbor he'd bullied. I printed out what I could: dates, missing signatures, a timeline of the board's filings. The librarian gave me a sympathetic look when I asked about prior neighborhood disputes. "You're not the first to look into the Pines," she said quietly, "but most give up when they hit a wall." I smiled, trying not to betray just how much was riding on this. My next stop was City Hall, a squat building of beige brick and chipped tile. I waited in line, nerves sparking, before finally reaching the clerk's window. "I need to see any enforcement authorizations for Crestwood Pines HOA," I asked. She rifled through records, returning with a thin manila folder, lighter than it should have been. No record of recent amendments, no city approval for the emergency enforcement Marcus wielded so freely. As I left, a sense of purpose steadied my nerves. Marcus had counted on intimidation, on nobody connecting the dots or fighting back. But the law was clear, at least on this. With proof in hand, I started to see the path forward, not just for my family, but for every neighbor who'd suffered in silence. Driving home, I rehearsed the conversation I'd need to have with Julia. This was bigger than us now. It was about standing up for the rule of law, for every tradition and memory those bylaws threatened to erase. For the first time since Julia's arrest, hope cracked through my frustration, a glimmer of real leverage. When I pulled into the driveway, the flag caught the late afternoon light. I looked at the planter, the plaque, the porch where everything started, and promised myself that the next move would be different. I wouldn't play by Marcus's script anymore. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and told Julia, "We have a chance. The rules he's using don't exist, not legally. We're going to fight this, and we're not alone." She met my eyes, her exhaustion melting into determination. "Then let's make sure everyone knows," she said. The first domino had tipped. That evening, as dusk settled over Crestwood Pines, I sat at our kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. Julia stood nearby, arms folded, eyes scanning each page as I explained what I'd found. The hum of the dishwasher, the distant clatter of kids' laughter from upstairs, it all felt strangely normal, like the world hadn't shifted beneath us. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that something fundamental had changed. The old rules Marcus depended on were hollow. Now it was up to us to prove it. Julia reached for my hand, squeezing it. "This is more than just a planter or a flag, isn't it?" Her voice was low, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. "He's betting no one will challenge him. We can't let him win." Her words grounded me, gave me focus. I fired up my laptop and started digging deeper. Online, I found legal forums filled with stories just like ours, homeowners beaten down by HOAs, only to turn the tables when they uncovered procedural flaws. I pored over state codes, court precedents, anything that could reinforce the holes in Marcus's case. The law was on our side, but only if we were bold enough to use it. Julia made coffee while I composed a letter of intent, a formal notice to the board detailing the missing amendments, the lack of legal standing, and our demand to void the fines and withdraw the complaint against her. I cited every statute, every city requirement Marcus had ignored. I wanted him to know this wasn't a bluff. Before I sent it, Julia sat beside me and added a line of her own, invoking her oath as a senator, to defend due process, even in her own neighborhood. We proofread it twice, sent copies to ourselves, to our attorney, and to the city. As I hit send, I felt a strange calm settle in, a sense that we were finally moving from defense to offense. Outside, porch lights flickered on, neighbors returning from errands and evening walks. I wondered how many of them were wrestling with their own fear, their own grudges against Marcus's rules. I thought of Paul, Mrs. Gordon, the Smiths. How many were one bad notice away from standing up too? Just after 9, my phone buzzed, a text from Aaron. It was short. "Saw what happened. I'm sorry. Be careful." I stared at it, uncertain if it was a warning or the first sign that someone on the inside might crack. Either way, it meant the board was talking. Our actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Later, when the kids were asleep, Julia and I sat on the porch in silence. She traced the letters on the plaque with her finger, eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You know," she said, "when I was sworn in, I promised myself I'd protect families. Never thought it would start here." I nodded, the weight of everything settling in. "We're doing this for all of us," I said. For my dad. For the kids. For anyone who ever felt powerless in their own home. In that quiet, I committed fully. This fight wasn't just for us. It was for Crestwood Pines, for every neighbor Marcus tried to bully into silence. We'd drawn a line, and tomorrow we'd see who dared cross it. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I stayed on the porch beneath the old porch light, the one my father installed with his own hands. I thumbed through a stack of old Polaroids, birthdays, picnics, our first winter in Crestwood Pines. Each photo seemed to hold a kind of light that I didn't want to lose. I promised myself I'd do everything I could to make sure our kids could look back one day and feel proud of where they grew up, not afraid. As I went inside, I glanced once more at the porch, the flag, the planter, the plaque. Legacy wasn't just a word. Tonight, it was a rallying cry. This time, we were ready to push back. The following afternoon, rain smudged the horizon and gave the whole neighborhood a restless, unsettled feeling. I watched it from the living room, tapping out messages to a handful of neighbors who'd quietly voiced support. Most were wary, afraid to put anything in writing, but the cracks were there, visible in the quick glances over fences and the way conversations halted when Marcus passed by. Word had started to spread. The Sanders family was fighting back, and not with empty threats. It was just after 4 when I heard the hesitant knock at our door. I half expected another notice, maybe even Marcus himself, but it was Erin Blanchard, raincoat dripping, clutching her notepad like it was a shield. She looked over her shoulder twice before stepping inside, eyes darting to the windows as if the entire board might be watching. The strain was clear in her hunched shoulders, the way she hovered by the door, her voice so soft I almost didn't catch it. "I don't have long," she whispered, as if admitting it was an act of betrayal. Her hands trembled as she opened the notepad, revealing a folded sheet covered in board letterhead and tight, nervous handwriting. They never filed the amendments Marcus keeps citing. I checked with county records myself. The last official changes were 3 years ago, nothing about emergency enforcement or fines. He's using old drafts. He's never followed through with the process. Erin's eyes shone with both relief and terror, the words pouring out faster now, like she'd been holding them in for weeks. He bullies the others. They're scared to contradict him. Half the time the votes don't even happen. He just announces decisions, and the rest of us are expected to fall in line. She looked down, biting her lip, shaking her head. I should have spoken up sooner. "I'm sorry about what happened to Julia. I tried to say something at the meeting, but he shut me down." I felt the ground shift beneath us, a witness at last, willing to stand on the record. "Can you put this in writing? An email? Anything?" "We'll need it if this goes to the city or a judge," I asked gently, not wanting to push too hard. She nodded, swallowing hard, then scribbled her signature at the bottom of the page and slid it across the table. "I'll send you what I can. Just be careful. Marcus doesn't like to lose." Julia stepped in from the hallway, catching the last of Erin's words. She crossed to Erin and squeezed her shoulder. "You did the right thing. It takes guts to speak up, especially here." For a long moment, Erin simply stood there, shoulders shaking as the weight seemed to fall away from her. "I want to help, Michael. I can't keep pretending nothing's wrong." Her confession changed everything. Now we had proof, direct, recent, undeniable. The board's power, so carefully staged, was nothing but smoke and mirrors. With Erin's testimony and the documents I'd gathered, the leverage finally tilted our way. When Erin slipped back into the rain, I watched her go with a strange mixture of pride and worry. I knew what it would cost her to take a stand, but I also knew she'd given us what no attorney or city record ever could, a living, breathing voice from inside the machine. Julia and I exchanged a look, a shared understanding that, from here, everything would move fast. We spent the evening assembling our case, affidavits, copies of Erin's notes, the timeline of missing filings. I called our attorney, laying out the new evidence and what we'd need to bring Crestwood Pines' quiet war into the open. Erin's courage rippled outward. Suddenly, neighbors who'd stayed silent started sending short texts of support, a few even volunteering statements about Marcus's rule by fear. For the first time since this all began, I felt real momentum. The HOA's armor wasn't just cracked, it was coming apart. We weren't alone anymore, and the truth was finally on our side. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, it felt like the storm was just beginning to clear. The momentum from Erin's confession pushed us into action. By sunrise, Julia and I had outlined a counterattack built on evidence, not outrage. We didn't just want to win for ourselves, we wanted to unravel Marcus's grip for good. I set up our kitchen as a makeshift command center, legal pads covered in notes, copies of bylaws, Aaron's testimony, every bit of proof laid out across the table. Our first step was consulting an expert. I reached out to an attorney who'd spent years untangling messy HOA battles and sent over everything, missing amendments, Aaron's affidavit, records from City Hall, and the text of state statutes. When she called back, her voice was equal parts impressed and alarmed. "If even half this is accurate, your board's been acting outside its legal limits for years," she said. "You have grounds for a formal challenge, and possibly damages for any fines paid by your family or others." Julia listened intently, occasionally jumping in to clarify legal terms or ask about next steps. Her experience as a senator suddenly took center stage. She understood the power of documentation, of paper trails, of building a record the city couldn't ignore. I watched her shift from survivor to strategist, her confidence infectious. "This isn't just about a planter, Michael," she told me. "This is about how power is abused and what happens when good people call it out." The attorney outlined our moves: file a formal complaint with the city, submit Aaron's signed statement, present a timeline of board overreach, and organize supporting affidavits from as many neighbors as we could convince. We needed to make the case unignorable, a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus as a rogue actor, not a misunderstood rule enforcer. With every step, I felt old doubts give way to resolve. Julia drafted letters to our neighbors, explaining what we'd discovered, never accusatory, just the facts, a simple invitation to stand together. I called Paul, the Smiths, and Mrs. Gordon, encouraging them to add their voices. Most hesitated, but a handful agreed, passing the message along the chain. At midday, Julia and I met with our attorney at her office downtown, a cramped room, shelves lined with law books, and the smell of old paper and strong coffee. While we waited for her to finish reading, Julia leaned in and whispered, "Remember when we moved in? You said this would be the place we'd finally put down roots." I smiled, even as nerves made my hands shake. The memory of planting our first tree in the front yard flashed in my mind. Neighbors coming by to welcome us, laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a good reminder. What we were fighting for wasn't just about us, but about reclaiming that promise of belonging for everyone on our block. We laid out the full timeline, organizing evidence for clarity. She listened, asked sharp questions, then nodded, satisfied. "It's all here. Now, you need to be ready for pushback. Marcus won't fold easily." Back in Crestwood Pines, the neighborhood felt different. Our porch, once the site of humiliation, had become a headquarters for quiet resistance. Neighbors stopped by, some just to check in, others to quietly offer their own complaints. Each story added fuel to the file: fines for wind chimes, warnings about kids' bikes, even threats over holiday lights. Every detail tightened the noose around Marcus's authority. That night, Julia organized a group chat for interested neighbors. The conversation was nervous at first, people afraid to use names or share too much. But as Julia explained the legal flaw, Aaron's courage, and the city's role, their tone shifted. By midnight, we had half a dozen statements lined up, and plans to gather more at the community clubhouse the next day. I watched Julia in the glow of the laptop screen, her energy undimmed, her faith in the process stronger than ever. "This is what real change looks like," she whispered, and I believed her. Aaron's stand had inspired a chain reaction. The board's threats, once so intimidating, suddenly seemed hollow. Our strategy was in motion. The evidence was ready, and for the first time, the outcome felt within reach. Marcus had ruled through fear, but fear was leaving Crestwood Pines, replaced by something much more dangerous: hope. By the next morning, our living room felt more like a war room than a home. The coffee table was covered with signed affidavits, printouts of board emails, highlighted bylaw excerpts, and a growing list of neighbors willing to go on the record. Julia had created a spreadsheet to track every incident and violation, color-coded, meticulous, impossible to ignore. The doorbell rang so many times before noon that I finally just left it open. Paul stopped by first, dropping off a notarized statement about the board's intimidation tactics. Then, Mrs. Gordon, hands shaking, pressed a thick envelope into mine. "If you think this can help," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Then use it. I promised her we would. Word was out. We weren't isolated anymore. The fear that had wrapped itself around Crestwood Pines was unraveling, thread by thread, with each new neighbor who found the courage to step forward. For months, Marcus had depended on everyone staying silent, but every fresh statement, every new witness, chipped away at that foundation. Julia set up a meeting at the community clubhouse, a neutral ground, familiar and public. I arrived early, carrying the evidence folder and a laptop, heart thudding with anticipation and a hint of dread. The clubhouse, once a place for birthday parties and summer barbecues, now echoed with the anxious energy of a neighborhood on the edge of change. At the refreshment table, someone had quietly placed a plate of homemade lemon bars, their scent cutting through the tension. Paul poured coffee for Mrs. Gordon, who thanked him with a nervous smile. For a split second, it felt almost normal, neighbors sharing something sweet, voices low, shoulders brushing. But under that surface was a quiet sense of resolve, a shared understanding that if we lost this fight, we might never get another chance. Neighbors filtered in, careful and quiet at first, until a dozen people filled the folding chairs and circled the old card tables. I welcomed them with a nod, careful not to take the spotlight from Julia, who stood at the front, composed and determined. She explained the situation. No anger, no dramatics, just a clear, methodical account of what we'd found and what was at stake. Then I laid out the plan. We would submit the formal complaint to the city, backed by Aaron's testimony and the documented pattern of board abuse. We'd share copies of every statement, invite every neighbor to sign, and prepare for a public hearing. We aren't just asking for fairness for ourselves, I told them, voice steady. We're demanding it for all of Crestwood Pines. A few neighbors still hesitated, scared of retaliation, worried about being singled out. But when Aaron arrived, nervous but resolute, something shifted. She stood beside Julia and quietly confirmed every detail of the board's misconduct. Her presence gave the meeting weight, a sense that this wasn't just our fight anymore. As the meeting wrapped up, people lingered, some hugging Julia, others shaking my hand, a few just sitting in silence as if still absorbing what had just happened. For the first time, the board's grip felt fragile. People were angry, but more importantly, they were united. That night, Julia and I worked late, organizing evidence, preparing the complaint packet for the city. We made a list of talking points for the upcoming hearing, rehearsed answers, anticipated Marcus's moves. The kitchen filled with the smell of strong coffee and determination. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch, letting the cool air settle my nerves. The flag snapped in the breeze, and the planter, my father's legacy, stood unbowed in the moonlight. We were ready. The board wanted a quiet submission, but we were bringing a storm. Tomorrow, everything would change. The day we submitted the complaint felt charged, like the air before a summer storm. Julia and I woke early, double-checked every document, then walked the packet over to City Hall together. The building felt impossibly official. High ceilings, worn tile floors, the faint smell of old paper. At the clerk's window, Julia slid the thick envelope across and watched the city stamp it received. Just like that, months of intimidation, humiliation, and silence became a matter of public record. Afterward, we headed back home to finalize our preparations. I sent an email to every neighbor who'd given a statement, letting them know the complaint was in motion. Julia crafted a message for the community group chat, careful not to inflame, just to inform. We've submitted a formal complaint on behalf of Crestwood Pines. Your voices matter. If you want to add your name before the hearing, let us know today. Throughout the morning, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Some people kept their distance, but many offered quick, nervous nods or brief words of encouragement as I passed. A few even dropped by with last-minute stories or signed statements. There was a current of anticipation. Everyone could sense the board's reign was teetering. At home, Julia reviewed the legal brief our attorney had prepped. It was bulletproof, clear evidence of the board's failure to file amendments, affidavits from neighbors, Aaron's insider testimony. We made copies for ourselves, the city, the press, and our lawyer, storing everything in folders marked for each recipient. Aaron texted to say she'd be at the hearing, ready to speak if needed. Paul came by, nervous but excited. I've lived here 12 years, Michael. Never thought I'd see anyone stand up to Marcus like this. His voice was shaky, but his handshake was strong. I realized that sometimes all it takes is one person stepping forward to tip the scales for everyone else. As the afternoon wore on, I tried to stay calm, cycling between moments of focus and waves of doubt. What if Marcus found some loophole, some way to spin things? What if the city sided with the board out of habit? Each time the fear crept in, I looked at Julia. Her unwavering resolve kept me centered. By evening, we had every detail ready. Evidence, talking points, statements, digital copies backed up and shared. Julia and I sat together in the living room, reviewing every contingency. The kids, sensing the tension, hovered nearby. I pulled them close and told them, quietly but firmly, "Tomorrow's a big day, but whatever happens, we did what was right." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out to the porch, breathing in the night air, feeling the weight of what tomorrow would bring. The porch light glowed over the planter and the plaque, the flag rippling in the dark. I remembered my father, his stubborn courage, his belief that neighbors should look out for one another. That was what this fight had become, a battle for the soul of our community. Back inside, Julia was waiting. She squeezed my hand, her eyes bright and steady. "We're ready," she whispered. For the first time in weeks, I believed her completely. Outside, the street was quiet, but inside, hope pulsed through the house. No matter what the board tried tomorrow, we'd already changed something fundamental. People were no longer afraid to speak, to hope, to fight for each other. The final battle was about to begin. The city council chamber buzzed with anxious energy as I walked in, folder in hand, Julia at my side. I'd been here before, back when I worked policy, but never with my own family's future on the line. Crestwood Pines' hearing was first on the agenda. A crowd had already gathered, neighbors shifting in wooden seats, a few local reporters setting up their recorders, city officials scanning paperwork, and, in the corner, Marcus with his usual entourage, shoulders squared, jaw tight, eyes sweeping the room like a general on the verge of retreat. Erin arrived, clutching her notepad, face pale but determined. She found a seat behind us, nodding at Julia with a look that said more than words ever could. Paul and Mrs. Gordon settled nearby, the tension obvious in their fidgeting hands. For the first time, Crestwood Pines didn't feel like Marcus's kingdom. It felt like a community. The council called the meeting to order, voices echoing in the tall, impersonal space. Marcus was invited to speak first. He took the microphone with all the confidence he could muster, outlining the board's commitment to order, the need for strict compliance, and pointedly the dangers of disruptive influences. His words skated over the truth, painting Julia and me as agitators, ignoring the reality of what he'd done. When it was my turn, I stood before the council, folder open, my heart hammered, but my voice came out steady. This isn't just about a planter or a flag. It's about the misuse of authority, about bylaws enforced without legal standing, neighbors intimidated into silence, and families shamed for honoring their past. I laid out the timeline, referencing every missing amendment, every gap in city filings, every threat Marcus had levied with no basis in law. Julia took the stand next, her presence commanding. She spoke not as a senator, but as a neighbor and a mother. We have a responsibility to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. This isn't just about our family, it's about the fabric of our community, and how easily it can be torn apart by unchecked power. The council listened, taking notes, pausing to ask questions. When they invited public comment, something remarkable happened. Erin stood up, hands trembling, voice thin at first, but growing stronger as she recounted what she'd witnessed. She described Marcus's private bullying, the board's refusal to hold real votes, the threats and intimidation that made honest service impossible. Her words shifted the air in the chamber. People sat up straighter, murmurs rippling through the audience. Paul spoke next, then Mrs. Gordon, their voices joining Erin's, stories weaving together into a tapestry of resistance. The city officials listened closely, some exchanging glances, others scribbling notes. Even the reporters looked up from their screens, sensing the mood in the room had changed. Marcus tried to push back, but his arguments felt thin, paper shields against the weight of living testimony. The council pressed him for documentation, for proof of the emergency powers, for records of properly filed amendments. He could only offer vague references, nothing official, nothing that would stand under scrutiny. As the meeting drew to a close, the council chair thanked everyone and promised a prompt decision. The chamber emptied in a slow tide, neighbors pausing to shake my hand, hug Julia, or simply nod in solidarity. Marcus left quickly, his shoulders hunched, the confidence that once held Crestwood Pines in its grip now scattered on the floor. On the steps outside, Julia squeezed my hand, and Aaron let out a shaky breath. For the first time, the silence that had ruled our neighborhood for so long felt truly broken. We had faced the board, the city, and our own fear together. Now, we waited for the final verdict. The waiting was excruciating. For 3 days, Crestwood Pines seemed suspended in anticipation. Conversations lingering on porches, neighbors checking their emails more often, kids playing under watchful eyes. I tried to keep life normal for the children, but every time the phone buzzed, my pulse spiked. Even Julia, for all her poise, grew restless, her resolve burning just beneath the surface. Erin texted daily, her messages brief but hopeful. "Any news yet?" The neighborhood had never felt so united in a single cause, nor so uncertain about what would come next. On the 4th morning, the verdict arrived. The city council's letter landed in my inbox at sunrise. Julia and I stood together in the kitchen, hands clasped, as I read the decision aloud. The council had ruled in our favor, citing the lack of proper filings, illegal enforcement of fines, and abuse of authority by the board. Every penalty against us and our neighbors was voided, the formal complaint upheld. Marcus was ordered removed as president, pending a special election. The city also mandated an outside audit of Crestwood Pines' HOA practices and recommended procedural reforms. I barely finished reading before the kids, sensing our relief, charged in for hugs. Julia laughed for the first time in weeks, tears shining in her eyes. The house filled with a joy I hadn't realized we'd lost. I texted Aaron, Paul, and Mrs. Gordon the news, then sent a message to the group chat. We did it. Crestwood Pines is ours again. The news spread quickly. Neighbors gathered on lawns, trading cautious smiles and handshakes. Erin arrived at our door with a bouquet from her garden, her face a mixture of exhaustion and pure relief. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I never would have found the courage without you." Julia hugged her tightly, then stepped out onto the porch, addressing the small crowd that had gathered. This was never just about a planter or a flag. It was about dignity, about our right to belong, to honor our stories, and to hold power accountable. Let this be the new legacy of Crestwood Pines. Later, the city's auditor began the review process, and for the first time in years, the community had a say in how things were run. Neighbors who'd kept silent came forward, eager to shape a new board, new rules, and a better future. Marcus disappeared quietly, his reign of fear finally broken. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Little by little, laughter crept back into the street. I spotted kids drawing chalk rainbows on the sidewalk, and for the first time in months, Mrs. Gordon's piano music drifted out her open window. Paul waved from his front yard, fixing a broken fence, and even the old mailman stopped for a chat. In those simple moments, Crestwood Pines started to feel like home again, like we had all decided, without saying a word, that fear wasn't welcome anymore. As for us, we reclaimed our porch. I replanted fresh flowers beneath the plaque, and Julia raised the flag with the kids cheering by her side. The planter, once a battleground, became a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging I thought we'd lost forever. That night, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and laughter drifted down the street, I sat on the porch with Julia and the kids, reflecting on how far we'd come. The scars would linger, but so would the bonds we'd forged fighting for what mattered. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now and share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. We'd started with handcuffs and humiliation, but we ended with hope and a promise that Crestwood Pines would never go silent again.